Okay, let me just welcome everybody. My name is Avi Weiss. I'm the president of the Taub Center. And first of all, let me start just by thanking everybody for coming and for wishing you all a happy new year, as Steve just reminded us to do. Hopefully 2022 will be a lot better than 2021 and 2020 were. I mean, they were good in many ways, but in other ways, we all know that we're still in the midst of a pandemic that is having a lot of waves throughout the entire world. I want to update you. We just put out our flagship publication, the Singer Series State of the Nation Report. We published it last week. It is available to anybody who wants to see it. We put out in the book. We put out chapters that are overviews of the 6 different areas that we cover inside of our research, and we also put out other new research papers, which are all very, very interesting. Unfortunately, we are still in this pandemic, and the chapters in the State of the Nation report naturally also cover a lot of what's going on or what went on during this difficult period. You're all welcome, but of course, there's a lot more than just that. Now, you're all welcome to take a look at it. Anybody who wants to take a look at the State of the Nation report, Michal, I think, will be sharing a link to the report. You're all welcome to go into it and to take a look at what we have there. So I'll just mention that a number of the studies are in the report were written by Professor Alex Weinreb, and including the paper that we are going to be hearing about today. And with no further ado, first of all, I want to thank Professor Weinreb for doing this. And with no further ado, I'm going to send it back to our board chair, Jim Angel.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Jim Angel. As Avi said, I'm the chair of the board of the Taub Center, and I'm going to be moderating today's call and helping to interview Alex. As we were just reminded, this call is being recorded, and I'll just ask folks to please mute themselves while the presentation's going on so we don't get any feedback and the like. As Avi said, we're going to be hearing from Professor Alex Weinreb. Alex's bio, I believe everyone has already received his bio, so I won't go into great detail, but in short, Alex is the research director at the Taub Center. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is the director of the Health and Sociology undergrad major. Prior to going to UT, Alex was a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Hebrew University. And Alex, for reasons you're about to hear, is one of Israel's leading demographers. The paper we're going to be hearing about today has gotten a lot of press that some of you may have seen, but we'll be hearing about that as well. The format today is I'm going to be loosely interviewing Alex. If you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat where hopefully we'll catch them and either integrate them into the discussion along the way or catch them at the end of the presentation. We've left a bunch of time for questions. So let's go ahead and start. The paper we're going to be discussing of Alex's is entitled Youth Bulge, Violent Crime, and Shortages in the Israeli-Arab Marriage Market. There's obviously a lot going on there. So before we jump into the findings of the paper, I wonder if Alex could say a few words about what prompted his research in this area to begin with.
Sure. Well, first, let me say I'm very, very happy to be here and sharing this with you. This is a paper which ties together all sorts of things which we cover at the Taub Center, and then I think pushes it a little bit further as well. Let me share with you just like a few slides. This is not going to be a heavy slide presentation, but there are some graphs primarily which I want to share because I think they will help us understand some of the underlying relationships which I'm going to be talking about. So, further ado. So, so in answer to Jim's question, like what really got me looking at this was the increasing attention being paid in the Israeli public, in the press, in public discourse to changes in the murder rate. So here we have trends in the number of murders in sort of Israel's two main populations since from 2011, 2021. And clearly these trends are going in very, very different directions. One was sort of stable and then increased quite sharply starting in 2016, and I mean that was in the Arab community, and at the same time in the Jews, in the Jewish population, it was sort of stable to going down. So since 2018, 2019, there have been, like I said, there's been increasing discourse about this, like what's causing it, et cetera, and the standard explanations which were being given were things which all sound extremely reasonable. In the Arab sector, there are subpar employment opportunities, there's a discrimination, there's a weakening of authority structures, there are imperfect capital markets, which mean that people, in order to borrow, they have to go to gangs, they can't go to banks, et cetera, et cetera. But from my perspective as a social scientist, all of those things, while true, did not explain the rise, because those were as true in 2018 as in 2012, as in 2002. I mean, they've just been factors in Israel for a long time. So part of what we needed to explain was not only the difference in the murder rate between the Jewish and the Arab community, but we needed to explain the timing of the rise in the Arab community. And that meant that there was something missing from the standard explanations. So that basically was the trigger to get me thinking about, okay, what's missing? Like what else is there which could explain the timing? And then, of course, given who I am and what I study, like the thing which I thought of first was age structure. So let me just explain what this is to those of you who may not have seen something like this. So this is what's known as an age pyramid. And what it does, it provides a visual way of looking at the age structure of a population. So on the left, you have men, on the right, you have women. On the y-axis, like the vertical axis, this is the age, and on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, that's the number of people at each age. So say, for example, so this is the age structure for the Israeli Arab population in Israel in mid-2021. And I can say, okay, so so if so I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I'm hovering around Arab men aged around 70. And if I go down to the x-axis, I say, okay, there are about like 3,000 to 4,000 Arab men aged 70. There are about 28,000 Arab boy babies, and et cetera, et cetera. I could choose any single age group, and it's a question of matching up my x and my y axes to be able to figure out how many people there are. Now, when I look at this age pyramid, I say, okay, this is what I'd expect to see. Like we all know the Arab age structure is very young. Like there are many more people age 0 to 5 than 30 to 35. And many more people age 30 to 35 than age 60 to 65. But the thing which I want to focus on here is what's called a youth bulge. And a youth bulge is a distortion from the normal gradient of an age structure, in particular in the late teens and early 20s, or late teens through mid 20s. So the Arab population in Israel has this distinctive youth bulge. It's not only that it has a young population, but there are actually many more people in the Arab sector who are in late teens and early 20s than there are who are, let's say, age 10 through 15. And this reflects the higher birth rates and you know, I mean, 20 odd years ago and a bunch of other things. But basically, this is an interesting phenomenon because it takes us back to a social science literature which emerged in the 1980s in the US, actually, where like a bunch of criminologists working with population scientists were like, oh, maybe we can explain the crime trends in like the US, like in New York, by looking at the age structure, and they were able to do it. So there emerged in the 1980s this idea that when you have like a large cohort of young men in particular, it doesn't matter about young women, but young men who reach their late teens and early 20s, that is going to be a risk factor for higher social instability. So that was the basic idea which emerged in the 1980s. Now I'll say that you know, there was pushback then in the 1980s and 1990s, because people were like, hold on a second, you know, but you go to college towns and there's a youth bulge there as well, right? Or there are lots of places you can go to in the world where there's a large group of people, men who are in their late teens through early 20s, but you don't have rises in crime. So the conventional wisdom which has emerged over time, and it's shown by many more studies in many places in the world, is that youth bulge by itself is not sufficient. You need to have a youth bulge, like a large cohort of people in their late teens and early 20s who are socially disengaged. It's the combination of those two factors which leads to social instability, to political instability, and that includes crime. So, you know, the question is, okay, so what does social disengagement mean? And basically, it's a large group of people not being in what some sociologists call a pro-social framework. They're outside normative, you know, sort of life. And the standard indicators of that are you have high rates of unemployment, underemployment, low enrollment in higher education. People are not in a framework like national service, let's say, and then later on in their 20s, they're not married in the same way, because marriage is also one of these things which anchors people socially. And I was like, okay, well, when we look at the Israeli Arab sector today, pretty much all those things, or at least the first three of those things, they are characteristics of the young men in the Israeli Arab sector. For example, so you know, we'll take the first of these indicators. In the 2 years preceding Corona, like preceding the COVID pandemic, the employment rates for Arab men age 18 through 35 fell by 7%. That's in the 2 years prior to COVID. When we look at like enrollment in higher education, so there's been a rise in the education levels for Arab men and Arab women over the last 20 years, but they've been much higher for Arab women. So in 2002, like if we use survey data from from the Israel Labor Force Survey, which is a large nationally representative survey in Israel, we look at the proportion of Arab men aged 30 to 39 who have a university degree. It was in 2002, it was 11%. In 2020, it was 18%. So that's a decent rise. But for Arab women, it went up from 12% to 35%. So that's which is clearly a much more significant rise. And then, if we look at trends, let's say trends in high school. So this is from some other research which we've done at the Taub Center. These are matriculation rates from high school this is the percentage of students completing their matriculation who are doing who are specializing in high-level technical education, which means that they are basically doing advanced math, right? That's so the little reddish, whatever color square that is, maroon, magenta, I don't know, that reddish square, those are the percentages for each of these sectors by gender in 2006, right? So if, let's say we're starting at the extreme right, so in the Bedouin community in 2006, roughly 6 to 7% of boys and girls were receiving, that they were finishing high school with that advanced math. Go to 2017, for girls, it's now in excess of 20%. For boys, it's somewhere around 12%. So it's increased for both sexes, but clearly increased much more for Bedouin girls. Likewise, in the mainstream Arab educational sector, increases much more for girls than for boys. So basically on both, again, if we go back to here, if we go back to all these standard indicators of what social disengagement is and how we go about measuring it in a meaningful way, we're like, youth bulge plus social disengagement, yeah, we can see both those things in the Israeli Arab sector. So this was really the first step, the first thing which we did in this study. And then we linked, we did a series of very small tests where we linked the year-on-year growth in the percentage of the Arab population, which is aged from their late teens to their mid-20s, to both the rise in crime, and we found a positive and significant correlation in the Arab sector. We linked it to survey data, where people are asked how safe you feel walking around your neighborhood. And again, the higher the rate of growth in the Arab sector, the less safe they felt, meaning the higher the percentage of respondents who said, I feel unsafe, that was only true in the Arab sector and not in the Jewish sector. So this was basically the first test that if we're trying to think about explaining the timing, which is how we started, the timing of the rise in the murder rate in the Arab sector, then it looks like it's related to the fact that over the last just a few years, there was the emergence of this youth bulge. This youth bulge, in 2015, those people were average age mid-teens. But when they got to average age 20, so that's when they're out of the framework. They're not in school anymore. They're not in the army, unlike their Jewish counterparts. And I'm sure we can talk about this some more. Anyway, so this was the first part of the study.
Alex, may I ask you a question as we go?
Of course.
So it's not enough just to be a young male to cause lots of problems in society, because some societies have lots of young males and don't have these problems. So you're saying it needs to be something on top of just the youth bulge. There has to be social disengagement. I just wondered about the educational factor, because in fact the male education is going up. So you wouldn't think that that would be a great measure of lack of social connection, except, so is it that is it really about the differential in education between men and women that is leading to this lack of pro-social framework, as opposed to just not as quick a rise in educational attainment?
I mean, I think that's certainly part of it. I think there is a growing divide between the attainment of Arab boys and Arab girls, or young Arab men and young Arab women, and that's expressing itself in different opportunities. So if you have, for example, if you have 1/3 to 40%, or it seems to be approaching that number, 40% or close to 40% of young Arab women are now going into higher education, and only half that percentage of young Arab men, then, like a young Arab man who's looking around, like he's unemployed, let's say, or underemployed, and his sister or the girl that he's thinking about marrying is going to college, something like that. Those different sorts of opportunity structures, I think, become meaningful in the person's own life. That's one factor. But the other factor has got nothing to do with the Arab community, and I think it has to do with the changing labor market. One of the things we take great pride in Israel is the fact, we have this thriving tech sector. I mean, like a larger share of the labor force is in high tech in Israel than in any other country. There's high investment in it, et cetera, et cetera. But what this means is there are a decreasing number of spots, arguably, on the labor market for unskilled people, and the reduction in employment which you saw for young Arab males, and like I said before, in the pre-COVID years, it fell in a 2-year span. It fell by 7 percentage points. It's a very significant drop. That's an indication to me that it's that there's stuff going on inside the community in terms of men looking at women and how they're doing so much better and we have no place. But there's also larger stuff, macro stuff in the economy as a whole, and you just have this increasing phenomenon where Arab men are increasingly and disproportionately the population with the least amount of education. And then there's a second factor which comes into play, which is there are plenty of parallel Jewish men like this as well. But Jewish men have a safety net, because Jewish men, if they flunk out of high school, they still have the army years, and many people who go into the army, they'll spend in their 3rd year in the army, they will make up their high school matriculation. So they're in a framework in their late teens to early 20s when they can't get into too much trouble. I mean, you can, as I know from stories, they can still get into some trouble in the army, but they're in a framework which very much constrains their freedom of movement and freedom of choice. And it gives them a second chance to some of them to finish out or to complete their education, which they may have not done so well in high school. In the Arab sector, because people in the vast majority of young Arab men do not go to the army and do not do national service. So if they flunk out of high school, that's it. There's nowhere else for them to make it up. So it's those things together, I think, which have created this problem.
Okay, thanks.
May I ask a question as well? The corollary of searching for social engagement, or the idea of social disengagement, the corollary might be searching for other unaffiliated Arabs in society, and that you haven't used the word gangs yet, but a lot of murder, at least in the United States, is surrounding gangs of people that have an affiliation for themselves because they all have the same problems. And the last question I would just ask is, so there's no national service. Maybe there should be an idea of a national service for Arab Israelis within the Arab community. And I'm wondering if that has ever been thought of by the government or by social scientists to ask its Arab youth to do do good things, help the communities they live in a service manner?
Okay, thanks, Mark. Those are great questions. Gangs, yes, completely right. People who are looking for meaning can certainly get it in gangs. It provides all this, all the solidarity building tools which people need, and that's precisely one of the things which is going on. This also ties into other things which is related to the modes of social organization in the Israeli Arab community. It's certainly built around extended family networks, and the gangs which do exist are built around extended family networks. So you can find meaning. It's pro-social in terms of pro-family at some level, right? And it's a substitute to trying to make your way in a labor market, which if you don't have sufficient skills to make it well, you know what? There's this to fall back on. So it provides an answer for all sorts of problems which are like arising. There can even be social pressure to join a gang. This we know from qualitative literature, because there are conformity issues which we're all aware of for people in their mid-teens and mid-20s. This is a time where it's difficult to be non-conformist in some places. So if it's a normative route to find a path through a local, we'd call them gangs, but it's a family business, then that can provide something. The national service within communities, there is increasing discourse about having some sort of not military national service, something equivalent to what most religious girls in Israel do. And so it's civil service, it's teaching, it's building paths, it's working as youth leaders, all these sorts of things. But there is, my understanding is there's still opposition from certain sectors within the Arab sector, because it still can look a little bit too much like collaboration with the state. And that's a hump which to get over it, it has to be driven by the communities. I don't think the state can do very much to force that issue, but it's certainly something which is being talked about, and I think rightly so. Yeah.
Yeah, so Mark, I just want to apologize because at the end, I know we want to talk about some policies that may be implemented to help resolve some of these problems or ameliorate some of these problems. And I certainly want to get to that in a few minutes, but I know Alex wanted to get to the marriage issue, and then maybe we'll double back for a broader discussion of the policy possibilities.
Thank you, John. So yeah, so the relationship between age structure and crime and the timing of crime was something which we like, okay, well, we looked for it, we've seen signs that are consistent with it, but then we wanted to push this a little bit further. And a little bit further, what I mean is, so the youth bulge right now, these are people in their late teens to early 20s, mid 20s. But we also know that marriage is one of these anchors, and so because there's a parallel, there's a separate literature in demography about Arab marriage and the age structure or the particular age structure characteristics of Arab marriage. So this was the linkage for me. And here we have the basic issue is this. I'm going to try to explain this also with the age pyramid. So for Arab men in Israel, the median age of marriage is somewhere between 25 and 29. I mean, the median age is 27. So the median range is going to be between 25 and 29. For Arab women, it's on average 5 to 6 years younger. so the average difference in age between Arab men and women is Arab husbands and wives is 5.5 years. And so, so right now we're like, okay, well, the number of Arab men who are in their median age of marriage right now is about 17,500 based on this. And for Arab women, it's more than that. It's about 18,500. So there are more Arab women who've reached the median age of marriage than Arab men. But like, what happens as this youth bulge of men and women ages? So what we did is we projected. So last year, the Taub Center, we published a bunch of projections for the Israeli population up to 2040. And we can use these projections to basically say, okay, whether the age difference between Arab men and Arab women remains at around 6 years, or if it comes down to 4 years or 2 years, this is what's gonna be the ratio of Arab men who reach the median age of marriage and Arab women. And look what happens in 2025, basically. It's irrespective of the spousal age difference, but there are going to be many more men on the Arab marriage market than women. Basically, when these lines go above 1, it means there's excess men who are reaching marriageable age. And this excess of men continues until deep into the 2030s. It may even continue beyond that. So basically, for the first time, we're reaching this situation, or a historical period, where because of higher survival rates of men than have existed historically, and because of sort of this weird youth bulge, which in part is the product of fluctuations in fertility. Fertility in the Arab sector is now coming down quite sharply. Then we're entering a new phase where basically it's going to be much harder for Arab men, or for the first time, basically, I'll take a step back. For the first time, there was going to be an excess of Arab men over Arab women on the marriage market. And this poses something of a challenge, because in Arab society in general, including in Arab society in Israel, there's an expectation of marriage for men, not always for women. There have always been sort of on average, sort of somewhere between 10 and 15% of Arab women have never marry. But for Arab men, it's always like 97, 98% of Arab men do marry. And remember that in the Arab marriage market as well, Arab marriage patterns include some measure of polygyny. Some wealthiest Arab men, typically somewhere between 8 and 12%, marry more than one wife. This is a society which is extremely conservative morally about sex outside marriage, especially for women, obviously. So you have these long-standing norms about marriage, which are going to hit this demographic wall, where suddenly there's going to be a surplus of men, and then you insert the stuff which we've already talked about, which is Arab women are increasingly educated. They're going to be increasingly independent financially and in other ways. They are probably going to be increasingly unwilling to marry much less educated men whose place in the labor market is much more limited, et cetera, et cetera. So, but that's on top of the sheer difference in the numbers. So basically, linking all this back to crime and the mechanism which we were thinking about before, like, oh wow, it's not only that this is a serious issue now, but if we're thinking about these measures of social disengagement, a rising percentage this youth bulge of Arab men, like they're not going to find, or society is not going to be able to find its solution in the fact that, look, they're all going to be married in a few years anyway, so it's going to be okay. So that was the added, sort of like empirical projection, which we thought was important to contribute to the conversation in Israel about where these trends are going. Because it's not only about explaining stuff which has happened in the past or is happening now. It's also trying to think about, especially if you want to talk about policy, then you have to think prospectively. Like, what is the world going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years when we're thinking about the policy interventions having some effect?
Well, so Alex, let's talk about those, because one thing I love about this work is the point you were just making, which is it's not only explanatory of a problem we see right now, but we can't just hope that a bunch of wild 21-year-olds are going to be settled down 24-year-olds in a few years and we'll just age ourselves out of this problem. But as you're saying, the problem is going to be more long-lived because of the age structure and exacerbated potentially by differential education rates. So since the problem is going to be with Israeli society for a while, or these dynamics are going to be with society for a while, let's talk about what you see as possible policy implications or approaches.
Well, I mean, I'm all ears if anybody has suggestions. No, I mean, again, if part of what we want to do as social scientists is we want to try to identify what the mechanisms are which are linking to two different phenomena, right? And if we think we're right about those mechanisms, then the mechanisms is where we look for policy intervention. So like, okay, so maybe if the problem is finding a place for people in the labor market, that's something that the state can do something about. Like, even after people have finished high school, like, we're not going to turn all of them into programmers. But there are all sorts of other jobs which can be done. There are lots of solid blue collar skills. There's that sort of element. There's trying to stop this from happening to the younger cohorts, and then we have more mechanisms, so more things we potentially can do. One of those, again, is to come back to this notion of national service, which we were talking about. If the years that we have to really be wary of are late teens to early 20s, where we're giving some sort of both meaning to people's lives, a framework, and also an opportunity where they can pick up skills. The skills, in this case, could be completing high school, it could be vocational, but some skill building which adds to people's like ability to find a good place in the labor market. Because I think, I'm an optimist by nature. I think most people do not aspire to a life to be criminals in their life. Like, most people actually just want a good, solid life where they can buy things which they want within reasonable constraints and have meaningful family ties and social connections. So those are the sorts of things we know, which I think we need to we need to build on. So the national service, some educational, filling the gaps, so people can have a second chance. And again, this is something which I said before, like Jewish youth that flunk out of high school, they have a framework. Like, the army provides that framework. There is nothing equivalent for the Arab sector. If I can add one more thing, you could say, hey, maybe we can legislate something about the marriage market, right? But I don't think so. I don't think the state, the state of Israel is going to get into legislating anything about who can marry whom.
All right. Great. Let's open it up to questions for the from the group. Michal, do you want to, can you read?
Sure. Mark, I see you have a question. Also, John Dunn had a question in the chat. Unless I've missed something, you haven't commented about lack of law enforcement as possible contributor to the rise of violence. Do you think this is a factor?
Okay. Yes. I do think it's a factor, but I don't think it's sufficient. There are more police operating in the Arab sector now than there were five years ago, and it's always difficult empirically to show this, right? When you have if you have more police now, is that because you're is that a result of higher crime? I mean, so the causation is certainly lacking. But I will say it's not only law enforcement at the police level. It's also decisions made by the government in terms of drug policy. So my daughter, my eldest daughter, was 21. She was in a combat unit, and where she finished the army several months ago. She served in a combat unit which guarded the border with Egypt, and they'd go out nightly and sit on the fence in like a camouflaged area, and multiple times she saw Bedouin gangs where they'd drive up to the border. There were sacks of drugs which were thrown over. They were under strict instructions from the higher echelons of the army not to intervene. And so there was millions of dollars worth of drugs being passed over. That was happening for several years during the Bibi administration, and it was one of the things which allowed for the amassing of wealth in certain gangs in the south. So that sort of law enforcement issue certainly was a factor. But the murder rate is not only concentrated, has not only risen down there, it's risen up in the north as well, nothing to do with drugs, anything. So yes, the law enforcement issue is a factor, but it's not sufficient to explain the timing.
I see a question from Mark Subal, which is, with Arab parties in the government majority and importance of that party, will there be significantly more governmental involvement in this area?
Yes, there will be. There is going to be more. There is going to be more investment in Arab communities. This much we know. There was already a significant round of funding for the Arab sector beginning in 2016. Like, I forget to the tune of how much. Avi or somebody else, if you know.
That was 15 billion shekel under Plan 922. Yeah.
I know part of, so is it, like a very, very significant amount of money. Part of the criticism of it was there were significant sums which were sidelined to like corrupt rackets of relating to construction companies which are related to gangs, et cetera, et cetera. So now apparently this time they're going to be more careful.
Alex, this time it's a lot more money. Also, they're talking about 35 billion shekel, and a lot of it is actually geared towards trying to end the violence. I think that's not a lot of it, but that's one of the things certainly that's being talked about.
Yeah.
But it'll be interesting to see how that money is directed in terms of, what do they think is behind the violence? So what's going to guide their allocation of funds? And that's the sort of, I think, insights that Alex work can help form.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that just that there's, you know, the changes which we've been tracking at the Taub Center. When you just look at things like the increasing graduation rates, like good graduation rates from high school and from college, those are things which are being driven internally within the community as well. And we're seeing, you know, signs as well of like increasing movement of young educated Arab couples to what were Jewish towns, you know, they're now increasingly mixed towns. So there's like we know from other work, 30% of the newly registered doctors entering the Israeli medical system are Arab. So there are more and more signs that there's a growing minority of highly educated, highly successful people. But the problem is not. The problem is with those who are left behind and who are disproportionately male. And that's where the efforts have to be addressed.
Gotcha. Mark, you have your hand still up. I think you have a follow-up.
Just the question I had was about what happened in Gaza earlier in the spring and the violence associated with the Arab community in mixed towns, and the government surprise about that, and JDC was a little surprised about all of that. How much does politics, what kind of role does anger at Israel play in the criminal rate in the Arab community? Is there anything political about it?
So people say that there is. There have been some interviews with like in this case, Bedouin gang leaders in the South who say explicitly, like, for me, crime is a nationalistic thing, or is a nationalistic motive. They stole our land, we're stealing back from them. Right? That's it's out there. I have no idea what percentage of people like who do this that is true for. I have no idea if it's just a post facto justification. People can politicize anything after the fact because, you know, we're human, that's what we do. But it's certainly something which is talked about, there being a nationalistic motive.
I would just add to what Alex is saying that we do see that a lot of the crime and a lot of the murders are happening inside of the Arab community and not between the Arab community and the Jewish community. So that to some extent would say that there is some portion of this, or actually a large portion, that is not motivated by what you're discussing.
Yeah. And thinking as well about the riots in May and again, it's always difficult for me to interpret those because you know we can see a few hundred people running around the streets, throwing stones, burning things, you know, like attacking somebody, some unlucky person who happens to be passing, and those are important things to pay attention to. But I never know how many people those few hundred represent, right? And that's the thing. Like, and even survey data, we just don't have survey data yet, which would allow us to be able to see what extent the attitudes which are reflected in those sort of acts of violence, if those are tapping into something sort of deeper and much more widespread.
Alex, what's the quality of the data you get in terms of, you know, who's committing these, what we know about their motivations, who the victims are? Is there a data issue here?
Yes, I mean, there's always a data issue, especially for me. I can find problems in all sorts of data, but it's but no, these data are extremely crude and limited. The only thing which we have right now is the number. Like we don't know. Like we don't know the ages of the victims. Like what we could do theoretically is go through press reports, like for the whole year, and create some sort of database. But basically, in this case, like in many cases, the state of Israel will release data by by population, by age, about 2 years later. So we'll expect the final data for 2021 murders to come out sometime in 2023. Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat from Ellen Portnoy about, is there a chance to have a GED for high school graduations?
Avi, do you want to address this?
ELCA is also doing a lot on in these issues. They're working with the municipalities, and there obviously is a lot of government education going on. Unfortunately, it wasn't nearly as much in 2020 as we would have wished, but that's a completely different discussion. But you know, I'm not sure what it is that you're looking for exactly. So maybe you could expand upon what you're looking for.
Yes, I was just wondering, because he said that the Arab young men do not get a second chance to get an education, whereas the boys who go into the military, if they flunked out, they can get it right at school. So I was wondering, isn't there anything in Israel that is an organized program like we have GED? Kids who don't graduate college can go back and do a GED program. And I was wondering if a program like that was available to Arab boys who didn't, you know, anyone who didn't graduate college, high school rather, so they could get their GED and then move on to college. That was my question.
Right. So the percentage that don't graduate high school in Israel is very, very low. In both the Jewish and the Arab population. It didn't used to be, but in the past, at least since about 2015, it's been in the upper 90%. So the percentage of those is relatively small. Additional types of training are necessary in today's advanced economy, and vocational training programs are very important. And the government does give quite a few of those. And I think also the thing that Mark was referred to very early on, and Alex strengthened, was the whole issue of giving some type of national service. Could be very within the Arab communities, could be very, very helpful in this sense.
Thank you.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions. I see a note that Claudio Pincus has a question.
Yeah, very interesting conversation, very interesting analysis, but several points. Number one, this seems to be a global problem. Scott Galloway from NYU published a book called After Corona, and he talks about the same projection and the same risk of young males being unemployed and in the same situation. But the same problem might be interesting to look at global solution, international solution. This is not just unique to as an Arab solution problem. Number two, I know that there are certain programs in Yafo, which is an integrated neighborhood or town where Jews and Arabs live very close with each other. And there are different attempts to be able to provide a process of identity to the Arabs to be able to take pride on the solutions of the problems of Yafo itself. So there are different experiments being done there right now.
Yeah, go ahead, Alice.
Well, thank you, Claudio. Yes. So the phenomenon of young women becoming more educated than young men is certainly a global phenomenon, but it's not happening at the scale. Meaning the difference is not as large as it is in Arab society. That's one thing. I'm hoping that it's going to become smaller in Israeli Arab society. But yes, to some extent, this is a global phenomenon. What makes the Israeli case different is the fact that there's this added political conflict. Firstly, so like the question about whether crime has nationalistic elements, I think that comes into play here in ways which it wouldn't in in Italy or in the US or in other countries where there is a difference in the educational profile of men and women. The finding social and residential spaces for where Arabs and Jews work and live is certainly something which is going on in Israel more and more. There are more and more social groups where this is happening. There are joint language projects, more bilingual schools. One of the things which we've been tracking at the Taub Center but have not published is on the rising percentage of Jewish schools which have Arab students in them, meaning the Arab parents choose to send their kids to Jewish schools so they can be educated in Hebrew. So there are all these things which are happening quite quietly in various places around the country, which are a testament to sort of more interaction in a meaningful way on a day-to-day level. So the things which I'm pointing to here are sort of is like the darker side, but there is a light side as well, which I certainly think it's important to remember.
I think it'll be interesting to figure out whether those interactions actually ameliorate the or undercut the more negative dynamics that you've been talking about, or if they're unrelated. I have time for one more question, if we could. It's from Charles Rosenzweig. He asked, getting back to Mark's question about national service for the Arab communities, and this is a question, I guess, for Alex or someone at the JDC. The question is, are there any government or JDC efforts to promote such programs for the Arab community?
I don't think there's any question. Certainly, the labor ministry is trying to promote all kinds of different training programs, vocational training and things along those sides. And in general, there's been a move towards more vocational training. And we saw in the graph that Alex showed before that there was a very large increase in that happening. And we know the JDC is very deeply involved in trying to assist with training and with finding jobs. So I think that there's no question that those are going on.
I think Charles's question was specifically about community service or national service programs, though. I'm sorry if I didn't enunciate that.
That's been discussed, but a lot less is going on actively from that perspective. Alex, do you know of anything going on specifically?
So no. So well, I mean, specifically, the only thing which I can point to is the fact that there seems to be a much more of this going on in the Christian Arab community, which is obviously very small, than in the Muslim Arab community. And the Christian Arab community is much more educated, is much more integrated. So there it's less of an issue, or it's an easier sell.
And of course, the Druze serve in the army, and they don't have the same issues at all. So that's a different population.
Exactly.
Well, we've run our hour, so I want to thank Alex so much for his presentation. I love that this is the kind of presentation where you get behind a troubling, sensationalistic, sometimes headline, and get at what may be driving these things. I want to thank you guys for joining us. I know it's early in the morning for some of you and late in the afternoon for others, so we appreciate you joining us today. Michal is going to put in a follow-up email or in the chat in case anyone would like to request some further information or a link to Alex's paper, which is fascinating itself. So I want to wish everyone a happy new year. It's not too late in my book. And thank you guys again for joining us, and take care, and we'll see you at the next one of these.